What did ancient humans do when two people in the group hated each other? Not disliked, hated. The kind of sustained, mutual hostility where two people can't be in the same space without the tension affecting everyone around them. The kind that has history behind it, a wrong that wasn't resolved, a competition that went badly, a betrayal that was never fully addressed. In your life, when this happens, you have options. You can leave, you can change jobs, you can move, you can stop seeing the person. The geography of modern life offers exit. Ancient humans didn't have exit. A group of 30 people in a specific territory, with specific resources, with specific threats on all sides, cannot functionally shed two members who refuse to occupy the same space. You cannot partition a cave. You cannot split the mammoth herd. The group needs both people, and both people have to keep functioning together regardless of what happened between them. So what did they actually do? And what does the answer tell you about the conflict you might be sitting with right now? Here's the thing most people don't realize about interpersonal conflict in small groups. It was never a private matter. A conflict between two individuals in a group of 30 affects all 30. The tension is visible. The alliances shift. The people adjacent to each party feel pressure to take sides or stay neutral. The cooperative tasks that require both parties, the hunt, the foraging route, the child care, become complicated. The emotional cost is distributed across the entire group. This is why conflict resolution in hunter-gatherer societies was never primarily a two-person problem. It was a group problem, managed by group mechanisms. The individuals involved were not left to figure it out privately. The community intervened. So what did that intervention actually look like? Here's the pattern that appears across hunter-gatherer cultures with striking consistency. Anthropologist Douglas Fry spent years documenting conflict resolution practices across traditional societies. What emerges from the cross-cultural record is a sequence that looks almost nothing like how modern people typically handle conflict. First, humor. Specifically, public humor directed at the conflict itself, jokes that acknowledge the tension, that gently ridicule the positions of both parties, that make the interpersonal hostility a subject of group commentary rather than a private wound. Not mockery that humiliates, strategic comedy that deflates. Second, third-party mediation. Not by a formal authority, hunter-gatherer groups are egalitarian, but by respected individuals who are not party to the conflict. Elders, skilled negotiators, people whose social capital derives from their ability to read and manage group dynamics. Third, public discussion. The conflict surfaces around the fire, becomes a group conversation rather than a private grudge. What's notable is what's absent. Formal punishment, authority-imposed resolution, legal process of any kind. If your threat detection system recognized something in that, subscribe. UG has been mediating group conflicts for 30,000 years, and he's developed strong opinions. You should hear them. To understand why the group-mediated approach worked, and why modern conflict resolution often doesn't, you have to understand something about what unresolved interpersonal conflict does to the human nervous system. Sustained interpersonal tension activates the threat detection system in a specific way. The person you're in conflict with, particularly if you live or work in close proximity to them, becomes a chronic low-level stressor. Your nervous system processes their presence as a potential threat, generating a low but continuous activation of the stress response. Over time, this chronic activation has measurable consequences: elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, immune suppression, reduced cognitive performance in tasks that require the prefrontal cortex. The person you hate at work is, in a measurable physiological sense, making you less healthy. Not because of the fight itself, but because of the unresolved, ongoing nature of the tension. What hunter-gatherer conflict resolution was doing, structurally, even without understanding the mechanism, was preventing the chronic activation phase. By surfacing the conflict publicly and rapidly, by deploying humor to reduce the emotional charge, by bringing in third-party mediators before positions hardened, the group was managing a social poison before it had time to become chronic. The modern equivalent of this is rare. Most workplace conflict, most family conflict, most relationship conflict goes unaddressed for extended periods. Because addressing it feels risky. Because modern culture emphasizes individual emotional management over collective processing. Because there is no equivalent of the campfire where the group naturally convenes and where the conflict can surface without anyone having to specifically decide to raise it. Ancient conflict resolution required no scheduling, no HR department, and no 45-minute commute to a neutral location. It required a fire and people who couldn't go anywhere else. Modern conflict management requires all of the above and usually still doesn't resolve anything. Here's what the cross-cultural research shows about what the group-mediated approach actually accomplished and what it couldn't fix. Christopher Boehm's survey of conflict management across hunter-gatherer cultures documents the full sequence of escalation and intervention. Humor and ribbing first, then more direct social pressure, then formal mediation, then the option of one party voluntarily leaving for a period to let tensions cool. Temporary separation, one party relocating to a related group for a season, was a documented option in many foraging societies. Not exile, not permanent resolution, a cooling-off period built into the social structure. This option is significant because it reflects something realistic about human conflict. Some interpersonal hostility doesn't resolve. The personalities don't align. The history is too heavy. What the group could manage was the containment of that hostility, preventing it from tipping into violence or group fragmentation, even when it couldn't eliminate it. The goal was not reconciliation in the therapeutic sense. It was functional coexistence. The two people who hated each other didn't have to like each other. They had to keep hunting together, keep sharing food, keep functioning as members of the same group. The community's mechanisms were oriented toward that functional minimum, not toward the emotional resolution that modern conflict management typically aims at. This is a lower bar. It is also a more achievable one. And for a group that couldn't afford to lose either member, it may have been the only realistic target. Here's the finding from modern conflict research that maps directly onto the ancient pattern. Psychologist John Gottman, in decades of research on couples conflict, identified what he calls bids for connection. Small gestures, humor, touch, shared attention as the most reliable predictor of whether conflicts resolve or escalate. It's not the resolution conversation that determines the outcome. It's the accumulated micro-interactions in the days and weeks around the conflict. Couples who maintain positive micro-interactions during conflict periods, who still laugh together, who still turn toward each other in neutral moments, resolve conflicts better than couples who withdraw into sustained negative framing. The ancient pattern, humor first, third-party warmth, public acknowledgement of the tension rather than private avoidance, was running exactly the mechanism Gottman's research would later identify as the most important one. The ancient toolkit wasn't primitive. It was calibrated for the human nervous system in ways modern conflict management often isn't. There's a dimension of ancient conflict that is harder to talk about honestly, the one that represents the failure mode when the group mechanisms didn't work, when two people's conflict couldn't be managed, when one party was persistently disruptive, dangerous, or unwilling to meet the group's minimum functional requirements. The group had tools for that too, and they were not gentle. Christopher Boehm's documentation of escalation in hunter-gatherer conflict includes ostracism, temporary exile, and in cases of persistent dangerous behavior, killing. These are not hypothetical. They are documented across cultures on multiple continents. The community that couldn't afford to lose either party's contribution could, in extremis, decide that one party's contribution was outweighed by the damage they were causing. This is the hard truth behind the warm picture of communal conflict resolution. The system was not infinitely tolerant. It had a ceiling. And past that ceiling, the response was severe. What this means for the modern context is that ancient groups were not idealized therapeutic communities where everyone's feelings were equally weighted. They were functional units under survival pressure, managing interpersonal conflict with the tools available to them, oriented toward the group's functioning rather than individual emotional satisfaction. The humor, the mediation, the public discussion, these were genuine and genuinely effective. They were also practical in a specific way. They were oriented toward keeping the group functional. When that goal aligned with one party's emotional needs, those needs got met. When it didn't, the group's functional requirements took precedence. Modern conflict management, by contrast, is heavily oriented toward individual emotional processing and resolution, toward how each party feels about the outcome. This is a genuine improvement in some ways. It takes individual experience seriously, in a way that hunter-gatherer conflict management didn't always. But it sometimes loses sight of the functional question. What does this conflict do to the people around the two individuals? What does the ongoing, unresolved tension cost the group? The ancient approach kept that question central, even at the cost of individual emotional satisfaction. The modern approach often inverts the priority. Neither is fully correct. The honest picture is somewhere between them. Conflict resolution that takes individual experience seriously while also holding the group-level consequences visible. That tension between individual emotional needs and group functional requirements is the same tension ancient humans were managing. They just had fewer pretensions about which one took priority when they came into conflict. Here's the last piece that puts the whole picture in perspective. The groups that managed interpersonal conflict well, that deployed humor early, that brought in third parties before positions hardened, that maintained the positive micro-interactions that kept functional cooperation possible, were groups that survived, not because conflict resolution is a soft, secondary skill, because in a group of 30 where every member's contribution matters, sustained unresolved hostility between two members is a structural threat to everyone's survival. Managing conflict well was a selection pressure. The groups that did it better had advantages. You are descended from those groups. Step back, and interpersonal conflict looks less like a personal failing and more like a structural challenge that every human group has faced since the beginning. The specific content changes. The mechanisms your nervous system runs do not. The physiological cost of sustained, unresolved tension, the chronic low-level stress activation, the immune suppression, the cognitive drain, is the same whether the conflict is with a fellow hunter over last season's kill or with a colleague over last quarter's project. What ancient humans had that you might not is a group that intervened, not because they were more emotionally sophisticated, but because they couldn't afford not to. The conflict between two people was everyone's problem, and everyone acted accordingly. Modern individualism has largely dissolved that architecture. Your conflicts are your business. The group that once surrounded you and deployed humor and mediation and social pressure to manage interpersonal tension has been replaced by the expectation that you'll handle it yourself or hire a professional. That is not an improvement in every dimension. It is a trade-off worth seeing clearly. Here's the one thing. If you're carrying sustained conflict with someone you can't avoid, a coworker, a family member, a neighbor, the single most evidence-supported thing you can do is not start with the resolution conversation. Start with a positive micro-interaction, something small and genuine, not performative, not a signal that you've forgiven anything. Just a moment of normal human contact, a question about something neutral, a shared acknowledgement of something funny, an offer of something practical. This is not giving up your position in the conflict. It is not pretending the conflict doesn't exist. It is maintaining the thin thread of positive interaction that Gottman's research shows is what allows resolution conversations to actually work when you do eventually have them. Ancient humans did this structurally. The fire, the shared meal, the group humor, before the mediation conversation happened. The positive micro-interactions weren't the resolution, they were the preparation for it. You're the resolution conversation you've been waiting for the conditions to have. Create the conditions first. And if the idea that your conflict with someone is never really a two-person problem, that it costs everyone around you, and that everyone around you has a stake in how it resolves, makes you think about how much of what feels like private struggle is actually a group-level resource drain? Good. Because that's exactly what the next one is about. What ancient humans did when a child refused to cooperate, and what it reveals about the deepest disagreement in modern parenting. That one's next.